poor widow was hired just to clean the barn, until the rancher found his twin sleeping in her arms. The morning light crept through the wooden slats of the barn, catching the swirling dust in golden beams. The widow moved silently through it, her hands rough from work, her back aching from nights spent on the cold floor of the small cabin behind the stables. She had been hired only to clean, nothing more. The rancher had made that clear when she first arrived. "You'll have food, a roof, and wages fair enough," he'd said, his voice calm but distant, like a man who'd already lost too much to risk feeling again. She didn't ask for kindness, she didn't expect it. Her only wish was to keep her 2 newborns alive. They were tiny and fragile, wrapped in old linen she'd sewn from the curtains of her former home before it burned to the ground. Each night, she'd sneak them into the barn after finishing her chores, cradling them in her arms as she hummed soft lullabies beneath the smell of hay and horses. The rancher was a man built by the land, broad shoulders hardened by years of labor, eyes sharpened by sun and sorrow. He lived alone, save for the horses and a few hired hands who knew better than to ask about the family he'd once had. He had buried his wife years ago, along with his will to hope. Work and silence were his refuge. He noticed the new widow's quiet diligence but paid her little mind. There were always widows, always people drifting west seeking survival. He had no room for their burdens. One evening, as dusk fell over the ranch, he returned to the barn later than usual. The horses shifted restlessly, their breath misting in the cold. A faint light glowed near the stalls, a lantern she must have forgotten to extinguish. He walked closer, his boots pressing softly into the hay. Then he stopped. There she was, sitting against the wooden wall, her head tilted in exhaustion, 2 small bundles resting against her chest. The twins. Their tiny faces glowed in the warm light, asleep and peaceful. She held them protectively, her arms curved like a shield, her face half buried in one baby's hair. The rancher froze. Something stirred deep inside him, a long-buried ache that had once been love, that had once been family. The sight disarmed him completely. The woman he'd barely noticed now sat before him, embodying every tenderness he thought he'd lost forever. He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath him. Her eyes opened, startled, and she clutched the babies tighter, fear flickering across her face. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They were cold. I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, quieting her. "You should have told me," he said softly. "I couldn't," she murmured, looking down. "No one hires a woman with mouths to feed. I just needed work. I'll leave if..." "You're not leaving," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. "They can stay. You can stay." For the first time, she saw something human behind his stern eyes. A gentleness. He bent down, his large, calloused hands brushing the blanket of one of the babies. "Twins," he said, almost to himself. She nodded. "They were born 2 weeks before I came here. Their father didn't live to see them." He swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he looked at the small, fragile faces. He saw his past reflected there, the same helplessness, the same desperate fight for life he once saw in his own child before fate took her away. He exhaled, a sound caught between pain and relief. Days turned into weeks. The widow continued her work, though now the barn seemed warmer, the air filled not only with hay dust but with laughter and soft cries. The rancher began to linger longer near the stables, bringing her food, fixing the broken latch on her cabin door, ensuring the firewood pile never ran low. She never asked why, she simply accepted it with quiet gratitude. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the ridge, they'd sometimes talk while the babies slept in their arms. He'd tell her about the seasons of the ranch, the storms that nearly ruined his crops, the mare that had to be nursed back to health. She'd listen, her gaze steady, her hands gently rocking her children. In those moments, the silence between them became something more than distance, it became comfort. But not everyone on the ranch shared the quiet peace that grew between them. The ranch hands whispered when she passed, their voices sharp with suspicion. One night, 2 of them approached the rancher, warning him that keeping a woman and her children would bring trouble, that it made him look weak. He dismissed them with a look that silenced the air. "If a man sees weakness in kindness," he said, "then he's never known real strength." Later that same night, the widow sat in the kitchen, staring into a cup of cooling tea. She'd overheard enough to know her presence had stirred talk. Doubt gnawed at her. She didn't belong here. She had only meant to survive. But when the door opened and the rancher entered, dust from the yard clinging to his boots, she saw something in his eyes that stopped her. He walked to her side, silent, then placed his hat on the table and sat across from her. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I don't keep you here out of pity." "Then why?" she asked, her voice almost breaking. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because when I see them in your arms," he said, "I remember what I lost. And somehow, it hurts less." Her eyes softened. "And when I see you," she whispered, "I remember what I still have." The barn became their world, a sanctuary of warmth and rebirth. The twins grew stronger, their cries turning to laughter that echoed off the wooden walls. She worked beside him now, her presence steady and sure. Sometimes, at dusk, she'd sit in the hay with the babies while he leaned against the stall, watching quietly as the golden light washed over them all. Neither of them spoke of love. It was too fragile a word for what they shared. It wasn't born from passion or chance, but from the quiet miracle of two broken lives finding a reason to keep going. The rancher would often stand at the doorway of the barn, his shadow long against the light, watching her with the children, his chest heavy with something he couldn't name. He had once buried everything he'd loved. Now, without meaning to, he had found it again, in the soft breath of two sleeping infants, and in the woman who held them like the world depended on it. And maybe, in that small, golden barn filled with the scent of hay and hope, it did. The nights grew longer as autumn crept across the valley, bringing with it the scent of rain and the promise of a hard winter. The ranch stretched under the fading light, its fences standing like the ribs of some giant creature against the horizon. Inside the barn, the widow's soft hum mingled with the rustling of straw and the gentle breathing of the horses. The twins had fallen asleep against her chest again, their tiny hands clutching the folds of her dress. She rocked slowly, not out of duty but from a tenderness that had become second nature. The rancher stood by the open door, the last threads of daylight painting his silhouette gold. He watched her without a word. For months now, their days had found a rhythm, her tending the kitchen and the young, him riding out before dawn to work the herd or mend the distant fences. Every evening he returned to that same light in the barn, the lantern swaying, her voice low, the babies wrapped safely in her arms. It was a sight he had come to need, more than he would ever admit aloud. Sometimes he would imagine what it might have been like if life had dealt them a different hand, if she had been his from the start, if those children had been born into his home rather than carried here by loss. The thought both warmed and frightened him. He had lived long enough to know that happiness was a fragile thing in a land like this. It could vanish as quick as a desert storm. That night, he stepped closer, the lantern light catching the lines on his face. "You should get some rest," he said softly. "It's getting colder by the hour." She looked up, the corner of her mouth lifting. "They sleep better here," she whispered. "The warmth of the horses keeps the chill away." He smiled faintly and crouched beside her, brushing a bit of hay from one of the twins' blankets. "You've got a way with them. Even the colts calm when you're around. It's just patience," she said. "And maybe a little bit of kindness." He nodded, his gaze falling on her hands, strong, worn, but graceful. "Kindness," he repeated quietly. "There's not much of that left in the world." The silence between them was soft, almost tender. Outside, the wind moaned through the fields, and the old wooden boards creaked like they were remembering every life that had passed through the barn. He reached out instinctively, almost without realizing, and touched her shoulder. The warmth of her skin beneath the thin fabric startled him, and for a moment neither of them breathed. "I should go," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't move his hand. "You don't have to." But she did, because though the air between them was full of something real and unspoken, it was also heavy with fear of wanting too much, of breaking what little piece they'd built. She rose carefully, shifting the twins against her chest. "Good night," she said, her eyes meeting his. "And thank you for letting us stay." When she left, the rancher sat for a long time on the edge of the stall, staring at the space she'd occupied. He didn't know what scared him more, the emptiness when she was gone, or the hope that filled him when she was near. Weeks turned to months. Winter came hard and early that year. The snows swept down from the mountains and blanketed the ranch in silence. The cattle grew restless, the fences iced over, and the nights felt endless. Yet inside the barn and cabin, warmth persisted, the steady fire she tended, the sound of the baby's laughter, the way her eyes softened when the rancher entered. He'd begun sharing his meals with her, sometimes sitting by the hearth while she fed the twins. The first time he held one of them, it was by accident. She had been stirring the stew and one of the babies began to cry. Without thinking, he reached for the child. The small body fit awkwardly in his large arms. The baby's cries quieted almost immediately, replaced by a curious silence as it blinked up at him. He froze, afraid to move. The widow turned, her lips curving into a faint smile that melted something deep inside him. "You're a natural," she said softly. He shook his head. "Haven't held a baby since." His voice broke, the words fading. "Since yours," she finished gently. He didn't answer, but she could see the truth in his eyes. That night, long after she'd gone to her cabin, he sat awake by the dying fire, remembering his wife. The laughter that used to echo in these same walls, the small girl who had run barefoot through the barn before fever took her away. He had sworn never to feel again after that loss. Yet somehow, this woman and her children had found the cracks in his armor and lit a small, stubborn flame within. When spring came, the ranch came alive again. The snow melted into rivulets that fed the grass, and the air filled with birdsong. The twins, now stronger, began to crawl, their laughter chasing away the ghosts that had long haunted the ranch. The hands respected her now, not because of anything she said, but because she carried herself with quiet strength, working beside them, cooking for them, tending to the sick calf when one of them couldn't. One afternoon, as she hung laundry in the yard, she saw the rancher returning from town. His horse was lathered, and his brow furrowed. She set down the basket as he dismounted. "What happened?" she asked. He hesitated, glancing toward the barn where the twins were napping in a cradle he'd built for them. "There's talk," he said finally. "A man asking questions. Says he's looking for you." Her face went pale. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair as she whispered, "Did he say his name?" "Derek Cole." The sound of it made her blood run cold. She steadied herself on the fence. "He was my husband's brother," she said finally. "But he's not looking to help. He wants what little we had left, and if he finds us, he'll take it." The rancher's jaw tightened. "You're safe here," he said. But she shook her head. "No one's safe when Derek wants something. He's cruel, and he doesn't forgive debts. My husband borrowed from him before the fever took him. I had nothing left to give, so I ran." He stepped closer, his voice low but fierce. "Then he'll have to come through me." That night, the ranch was quiet but tense. The widow tried to sleep, but every creak of wood and whisper of wind set her heart racing. Near midnight, the rancher stood watch outside the barn, rifle resting on his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkness. He knew what kind of men came after widows, desperate, mean ones who mistook kindness for weakness. He wasn't going to let them touch her. Just before dawn, hoofs thundered in the distance. A single rider approached, the outline of his hat sharp against the paling sky. The widow ran from the cabin, clutching her shawl tight. "It's him," she whispered. Derek Cole rode up slow, his grin cruel beneath his mustache. "Well, ain't this something?" he drawled. "Didn't think I'd find you playing house on someone else's land." The rancher stepped forward, calm but unyielding. "You've ridden far enough." Derek smirked. "This your man now?" The mighty rancher playing daddy to bastards that ain't his. The widow flinched, but the rancher didn't move. His voice was like gravel when he spoke. "You best turn around before you say another word you'll regret." Derek laughed. "Regret? Hell, I came for what's owed. That woman's husband took $50 from me before he died. Those kids, they're mine now until it's paid. You'll leave now," the rancher said quietly, raising his rifle just enough for the light to catch the metal. For a moment, the air froze. Then Derek's grin faltered. He spat into the dirt, eyes narrowing. "You'll regret crossing me." With a harsh tug on his reins, he turned his horse and rode off, dust rising behind him. The widow stood trembling, her breath shallow. The rancher lowered his rifle and looked at her. "He won't be back," he said, though his tone betrayed doubt. But he did come back. 2 nights later, with 3 men at his side. They came after dark, torches flickering as they approached the barn. The horses neighed in fear, and the twins began to cry. The widow ran to them, clutching them close. The rancher burst from the house, shotgun in hand, shouting for his men. The ranch erupted into chaos, gunfire echoing through the fields, horses breaking free, flames licking at the barn doors. Derek's men shouted, their shadows darting through the smoke. Inside, the widow tried to find a way out, her heart pounding. She wrapped the babies in a blanket and pressed them close, whispering prayers through her tears. The fire climbed fast, devouring the hay and wooden beams. She turned toward the back door, only to find Derek standing there, his face twisted with rage. "Where do you think you're going?" he sneered. "Please," she begged. "There are children. They're mine by right," he spat, grabbing her arm. She struggled, crying out. The rancher appeared through the smoke, tackling Derek to the ground. They fought viciously, fists landing heavy, the fire roaring around them. The widow ran, clutching the twins, stumbling through the heat and smoke until she burst into the night. One of the ranch hands caught her and pulled her to safety as the barn roof caved in behind them. Flames shot into the sky. For a moment, it seemed like everything they had built was burning to ash. But then the rancher emerged, bloodied, coughing, but alive. Derek lay still behind him. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, chest heaving. The widow ran to him, tears streaking her soot-covered face. She fell beside him, pressing the babies against his chest. "You're hurt," she whispered. He shook his head weakly. "They're safe. That's all that matters," she sobbed, clutching his face in her hands. Around them, the ranch hands worked to douse the flames, but the barn was lost. Dawn broke slowly, painting the smoke in shades of gold and gray. The rancher sat there long after the fire died, the twins asleep once more, their breaths small and steady against him. The days that followed were hard. The barn was gone, the fences scorched, and the air smelled of ruin. But the widow refused to leave. Together, they rebuilt, side by side, board by board. The men followed his lead, and soon the sound of hammers and laughter replaced the crackle of burning wood. By summer, the ranch was alive again. The new barn stood taller than before, its walls strong and clean. The twins toddled through the hay, their laughter echoing under the beams. The widow often worked near the stalls, her dress brushed with straw, her hair loose in the warm breeze. The rancher would watch her sometimes, feeling something in his chest that was no longer just gratitude, it was belonging. One evening, he found her sitting in the doorway of the barn, the twins asleep beside her. The setting sun bathed her face in light, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He just stood there, memorizing the way she looked, peaceful, strong, and entirely his heart's undoing. "I used to think this place was cursed," he said finally, sitting beside her. "Every time I cared for someone, the land took them away. But now," she turned to him, eyes shining. "Now it's given you back something, hasn't it?" He nodded slowly. "More than I deserve." They sat in silence for a long while, the air filled with the hum of crickets and the soft breathing of the children. Then, almost shyly, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, rough and steady. No vows were spoken, no promises made. They didn't need them. The land, the fire, and the love they had rebuilt together spoke louder than words ever could. Years would pass before anyone in the nearby town stopped calling her the widow. By then, she was simply known as the rancher's woman, and the twins grew up strong under the same golden light that had once revealed their mother's quiet courage. The barn that had burned down became a story, a memory of survival told to the children who worked the fields. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the air was still and the stars burned bright over the plains, the rancher would walk to the barn door and pause, listening. The faint echo of a woman's hum, the soft rustle of straw, the steady breath of life around him, all of it reminded him that sometimes, even in the harshest of places, love found a way to take root and bloom again. The first frost of winter crept across the valley like a slow ghost, silvering the fences and glazing the creek behind the barn. The widow stood at the doorway with her shawl pulled tight, the twins bundled in her arms, their tiny breaths clouding in the cold. Inside the barn, the rancher worked silently, his breath steady, the sound of his tools rhythmic against the stillness of morning. Life had grown steady between them, not with grand gestures, but with small, quiet acts that built a bond neither of them dared to name. But winter in the west was merciless, and with it came trouble. The herd had grown restless, feed was running low, and a new kind of danger began to rise on the horizon. Men who traveled from ranch to ranch, taking what they pleased from those too weak or too few to resist. Rumors of raids reached them before the first tracks appeared in the dust, and though the rancher said little, she saw the worry etched into his brow each evening as he cleaned his rifle by the fire. One night, as the wind howled through the valley, he came to her cabin, the lantern casting a golden halo around him. "Keep the children close tomorrow," he said. "If I'm not back before sundown, you take the trail east and don't look back." She felt her chest tighten. "What's coming?" "Men who've forgotten what it means to work for what they have," he said. "They'll come looking for supplies, or worse. I'll handle it." Her eyes met his, filled with both fear and defiance. "You're one man." He paused, his jaw setting. "One's enough when the land's worth protecting." The next morning broke cold and gray. The ranch was silent except for the groan of the wind against the old fences. She stayed inside the cabin, rocking the twins while every creak outside sent her heart racing. Hours passed before she saw the dust cloud in the distance, a handful of riders cutting through the plain like dark arrows. She ran to the barn, peering through the cracks between the boards. The rancher stood in the yard, rifle in hand, waiting. The riders slowed as they approached. The man in front, tall, scarred, his coat tattered, called out, "Heard this place is sitting on full stores. We're just here to collect our share." "This ranch feeds families," the rancher replied. "You won't take what you didn't earn." The man smirked. "Then I guess we'll earn it by taking it off your body." The first shot cracked like thunder. The widow flinched, clutching her children close as the echoes rolled through the valley. More shots followed, sharp and hollow against the wind. Horses screamed, men shouted. She could see flashes of movement through the gaps in the wood, the rancher taking cover behind the well, returning fire with measured precision. He moved with the calm of a man who'd long made peace with death, every motion deliberate, every shot sure. Then the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was thick, cruel. She waited, breath trembling, before pushing open the barn door. Smoke drifted across the yard. 3 men lay still on the frozen ground. The rancher stood alone, leaning heavily on the well, blood soaking his sleeve. She ran to him, dropping to her knees. "You're hurt," she whispered, her hands shaking as she pressed against the wound. He grimaced but managed a small smile. "Just a graze. They're gone." Tears burned her eyes. "You could have died. Maybe," he said quietly, "but then who'd watch over you and the little ones?" She looked up at him, the cold air biting her cheeks. For the first time, she didn't see the hardened rancher who'd hired her out of pity. She saw the man beneath, worn but unbroken, his strength. Not in his hands but in his heart. She wanted to speak, to tell him what he'd come to mean to her, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she took his hand and held it tight. Winter dragged on, harsh and unrelenting, but together they endured it. The rancher taught her how to tend the herd, how to mend fences and read the weather by the way the clouds curled over the hills. At night, she'd sit by the fire with the twins while he told stories of the Old West, of trails once crossed, battles once fought, and dreams long buried beneath the dust. Slowly, the cold began to ease, and with the thaw came something gentler, something they no longer denied. One evening, as the snow melted into the soft earth, he stood beside her outside the barn, the sunset bleeding red and gold across the sky. The twins toddled nearby, chasing each other through the grass. "They're growing fast," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "They'll be walking before spring," she replied. "You've given them more than I ever could." He shook his head. "No, you gave them life. I just gave them a place to belong." She turned to him then, her eyes shimmering in the fading light. "You've given me that too." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You make this place feel alive again," he said softly. "For years I thought I was just waiting to die out here. But now, every morning feels like something worth waking to." Her hand found his, fingers threading through his rough calloused ones. "Then don't wait anymore," she whispered. In that quiet, the distance between them vanished. He drew her close, the world falling away until there was only the sound of wind through the grass and the steady beat of his heart against hers. It wasn't the wild fire of youth but the deep, steady warmth of two souls that had survived too much to ever take love for granted again. The ranch became their home in every sense. The widow no longer felt like a visitor or a worker. She was part of the land, part of the story written in its soil. Together they rebuilt what had been broken: the fences, the barn, and the invisible walls that had once kept their hearts guarded. The twins grew strong and curious, their laughter echoing across the open fields. Years passed quietly. The West changed. Towns grew, roads stretched farther, and the wild began to fade beneath the weight of civilization. But on that small stretch of land, time seemed to slow. The rancher and the woman often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset the way others might watch a promise fulfilled. One summer night, the twins now old enough to ride ponies of their own, she turned to him and said, "Do you ever think about the day you found us in the barn?" He smiled faintly. "Every day. You were the first thing in years that made me believe the world hadn't forgotten how to be kind." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You gave us a chance when no one else would. You saved us." He looked out over the fields, golden under the moonlight. "You saved me first." As the wind swept gently through the tall grass, carrying the scent of earth and freedom, the rancher's hand found hers again. The horizon stretched endless before them, uncharted, wild, eternal. Life in the West had never been about riches or power. It was about endurance, about love born from hardship and the courage to begin again when all seemed lost. And so, beneath the boundless sky that had once watched him bury his past, the rancher now stood beside the woman who had given him back his future. The land was still harsh, the days still long, but the loneliness was gone. Where once there had been only silence, now there was laughter. Where once there was only dust and grief, there was life, warm, fragile, and fiercely alive. The rancher knew that someday, the world would forget his name. But the sound of those children's laughter, the light in her eyes, and the love that had grown out of the hardest soil, that would linger long after he was gone. The West had taken much from him. But in the end, it had given him everything that mattered. Thank you for watching the video. Folded hands. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming tales full of emotion, mystery, and passion for the Old West. Cowboy Hat Face. Your support means a lot and helps us keep creating more content for you.